Well, good morning, everyone. It seems impossible that we're already at week 3, as Tanya just said. And I want to thank all of you again for the great discussion we had last week. And once again, urge you to keep up the fantastic effort. Certainly the interaction, I'm hoping, when you meet in your mastermind groups is every bit as exciting as I find our discussions on Thursday. I would imagine that is absolutely true. As we move on, I want to remind you of a question I believe I mentioned early on in the course that we're going to discuss at the very end, our last particular session together. And that question is this: what did you learn this course that you found most valuable to you in the leadership role you now have? And why was that important? This is an effort, once again, as we go through and talk about techniques, ideas, concepts, and principles, let's roll this back in, be reflective, and think about how we can apply it to making the organizations we're now in charge of just that much better. So for today, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about 4 or 5 things. What's the most important leadership traits? We're going to talk about the issue of loyalty and trust, and that loyalty goes up and down. We're going to ask you the following question in your organization: are you a heat shield, and do you provide background music? And then fourthly, we're going to talk about how you lead across generations. There's a lot of discussion, of course, in many areas about how people lead: men who lead women, women lead men, leading people across different ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And one I think is somewhat neglected, and I find just fascinating, is how you lead across generations. And we'll find here in a few minutes that there's 4 or 5 generations in the modern workforce. And then we're going to wrap up by asking a very simple question: what does it mean to be a boss, and what does it mean to be a leader? Now, with that in mind, of course, leading others is the one part of the paradigm that's probably most talked about. Again, as I believe I mentioned in the past, if you were traveling and you stopped at an airport bookstore, you'd probably find a whole rack on leadership and management, and most would talk about leading others. So in some ways, I would almost argue with you, of the 4 aspects of this paradigm, leading up, leading peers, leading self, as well as leading others, it might actually be the easiest, because there is a hierarchy established and there's so much literature about it. But it doesn't mean that is easy. It just might be easiest in comparative to those others. With that little introduction, let's get started. Are you a heat shield? You know, things will go wrong. People will make mistakes. I always say that's why God put erasers on the end of pencils. When it does go wrong, how do you react as the boss? Do you publicly lose your temper? Does your team immediately start thinking about a bus? Now, why would they start thinking about a bus? Because they've been conditioned, when things go wrong, the first thing the boss is going to do is look for a bus and then determine who he or she is going to throw under the bus. So in some ways, the crisis, when something goes wrong on the team, can be an opportunity to build trust as you become a heat shield. Do you, in fact, stand up for your team and say, mistake has been made, I accept responsibility, I am accountable, it's my team, I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We're going to do some retraining and figure out what went wrong, and we're going to fix it for the future. You may recall a couple of years ago that there was a report that a North Korean missile was heading for Hawaii. And there was a great turbulence on the island, and people were running around in all directions because there was a report that this might be occurring. It was put out by the Hawaiian Emergency Management System. It turned out to be a false alarm. When it was all over, the head of the Hawaii Emergency Management System stood up in front of the press and said that a mistake had been made. He accepted responsibility for it and said there would be an investigation held. He would call a press conference, announce what measures were going to be taken to rectify so it didn't happen again, and basically close the press conference. The name of the person who had accidentally released what was a training message, which went out to the public, telling them that this missile was on the way, his name was never released. He was eliminated from the organization. He was, in fact, fired, but he was not publicly humiliated by the organization. After that particular period of time went by, investigation was conducted, training sessions were done, new processes, procedures were conducted. The head of the Hawaii Emergency Management System called that second press conference he had promised, explained exactly what had happened, explained what process and procedures had now been changed, and then he said, I accept full responsibility for what happened. I now hereby announce my resignation. he had been the ultimate each year. He had taken responsibility for the team. Because as you see here, success has 1,000 fathers, while failure is an orphan. And you will always be successful at finding someone to blame. But that crisis can also be an opportunity to build trust, because if you take accountability for the team, then in fact, I would argue they will do anything for you in the future, because you have established yourself as their leader, as their heat shield. Now, don't misunderstand. Don't misunderstand. There are people that just won't fit. And you need to make sure that you explain to people up front at the onset of their employment, what are those things that will cause them to lose their job almost immediately, which are normally issues about ethics. You know, if I catch you lying, cheating, stealing, etc., abusing narcotics, abusing alcohol, you know these things far better than I from organizations you have been part of. Those are zero defects mistakes, and you will be eliminated. But you need to think about this as well in terms of developing people, because no one's ever had a perfect human relations management system that invariably made sure that not even one person who was unable to manage the job was in fact hired. You might also reflect on the fact, on the admonition of Jim Collins in the book Good to Great, which I've mentioned a couple times, and certainly probably will mention again. And Collins talked about, in terms of hiring people, he said, remember the following. Your goal is to get the right people on the bus, get the wrong people off the bus, and get everybody sitting in the right seat. So let's wrap up by talking about this question. What's the difference between a boss and a leader? I like this quote by Ronald Reagan: a good boss takes a little more than his share of the blame, back to that being a heat shield, and a little less than his share of the credit. I think that's a nice way of thinking about being a leader or being a boss. Well, let me contrast two people, both of whom, by the way, were successful. Now, this is Jack Welch. Jack Welch was a former chairman and CEO of GE. And you got to give Jack Welch his due. He adapted GE. He was a firm believer in giving people performance reviews, very clear performance reviews. In fact, what he would insist on happening is that every year that you got rid of 10% of the people on your team. That's just a matter of racking and stacking and forcing you as the person in charge of a group to think through how your people were performing. He moved the market cap of GE from $14 billion when he took it over to $410 billion. So as that measure of success, you'd have to say Jack Welch was quite a success. It did, in fact, prosper under his leadership. But there was a significant fall off in the performance of the organization after he left. So you get down to that question as a leader, what is my measure of success? Is it how well the organization did when I was in charge, or how well it did after I left? Was I able to create systems, hire people, and develop teams that continued to excel even after I had stepped away? Somebody said to me one time, the true mark of a leader is making yourself irrelevant.